Ric Flair, To Be the Man, Chapter 4. Chapter 4, The Man Who Saved Wrestling. And then there's a picture of Ric Flair looking really stylish, and he's sitting down with his legs crossed. Mike Farkas was a Vietnam vet who was looking to make a couple of extra dollars. We started talking one night at a bar, and he told me that he was a pilot. At that stage, the wrestlers in Mid-Atlantic were making some pretty long driving trips, about 300 miles to Richmond, even further to Norfolk, and Farkas made me a proposition. How about I get a bunch of the boys together and have him fly us instead? The first wrestler I approached was Johnny Valentine. He liked the idea of commuting 45 minutes by air instead of 5 hours by car. If we loaded up the plane with 5 or 6 guys, it would only cost about $100 apiece. No one had bothered investigating Mike's background or qualifications, so in no time at all he was the official pilot of Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling. On the afternoon of October 4th, 1975, 5 of us piled into his yellow and white Cessna 310, a light twin-engine to fly from Charlotte to Wilmington, North Carolina, where we had an outdoor show at Legion Stadium. This was a tiny plane, so the guy with the most stroke got the largest seat next to the pilot. That was Valentine. Because of our size, the rest of us were really crammed in there. I was in the middle with Tim Woods. The guys at the bottom of the pecking order, David Crockett and Bob Bruggers, were in the last row. Originally, Wahoo was supposed to join us, but he had decided to drive at the last moment, and Bruggers had taken his place. We were something like 1,400 pounds over gross, and Farkas couldn't figure out how to distribute our weight properly. To lighten the load, unknown to us, he dumped some fuel out of the gas tank. Here's an anecdote by David Crockett. When I got to the tarmac, I saw the pilot outside the plane checking the fuel. I said, "Make sure we have enough fuel in there." I was just joking. I'd never flown with him before. I wasn't even supposed to be on the plane. My brother Jimmy was going to travel with the boys, but he was sick with the flu. He called me up and asked if I could go to Wilmington instead. I said, sure. It was an easy flight, no headwinds. I guess around Lumberton, which is about the halfway point, the left engine started to sputter, then shut down. We were all concerned, especially as the plane dipped some. In retrospect, I never figured out why we didn't just land in Lumberton or someplace else, someplace close. But Farkas said that a twin-engine plane was designed to carry us on a single engine, so we continued on. Valentine pointed at the gas cages and started laughing. We're out of fuel! The left engine was on empty, but we all thought we had reserve gas. There was something major going on, and Farkas was yelling to the control tower over the headphones, but it was loud on the plane, so I couldn't hear what he was saying. We had just crossed the Cape Fear River when the right engine dies. I was thinking, God, when are we going to activate the reserve tanks? Then I heard a boom, and it scared the shit out of me. David Crockett has an anecdote. We were making our approach to New Hanover Airport, but the plane was too low. We almost hit a water tower. The pilot tried to pull up, but the engine stalled. There wasn't enough power. Had we been flying higher, we would have made it to the clear area of the runway. That's how close we were. Farkas began to panic, and Valentine tried bringing him to his senses the only way he knew how, by slapping the guy. It didn't work. We were sputtering and spinning the whole time. It's strange how your mind works during a crisis. Tim Woods later said he was nervous because he wasn't wearing his shoes. Austin Idol, another wrestler, had told him that when he was in a plane crash, he had taken his shoes off and as a result tore his feet down to the bone. Tim didn't have time to grab his shoes, but he got hold of the pilot's briefcase and stuck his feet inside. David Crockett again. I remember it becoming quiet on the plane. At a time like that, you get into yourself and wonder if you're going to survive. I didn't want the wind knocked out of me, so I bent over and grabbed my knees, controlling my breathing. Out of the corner of my eye, I remember seeing a light flashing on the dash and hearing a buzzer. I was later told that it was probably the stall warning. That was just before the crash. I have no memories past the point where the second engine conked out, but I know what happened. The plane cut across several treetops and a wing collapsed against a utility pole before we nosedived, crashing into a railroad embankment. If we had gotten past the trees, we would have ended up on the runway. On the ground, the pilot managed to stall the plane enough to reduce our sliding. We still crashed hard, going at close to 100 miles per hour, but it could have been a lot worse. All the seats broke loose and the guys crumpled into each other. David's head crashed through the seat in the front of him, cracking and bruising Tim Wood's ribs. David received a concussion and a slight compression fracture in the collision. Tim remembered because he was the only passenger who wasn't knocked unconscious. When I woke up, I was being pulled off of the plane and placed into an ambulance. "We better hurry," I said, one EMT said to his partner. "We might lose this one." I thought they were talking about me, but they were actually referring to Bruggers. Both he and Valentine had gone into shock. I blacked out again, and when I came to, I was on one of those old steel X-ray tables. As disoriented as I felt, I still recognized the voice asking, "You all right, kid?" It was Wahoo. I'd just beaten him for the Mid-Atlantic title, and we were supposed to wrestle that night. When he barged into the hospital, the orderlies tried to restrain him. On TV, we hated each other, and they actually thought he was coming to finish me off while I was lying at the death's door. That's how real it was to the fans. Wahoo pushed past everybody, breaking all the protocols of our business, to be there for me the way he always was. Thank God Wahoo had driven to Wilmington. What would the fans have thought if he'd have been pulled out of a small, intimate plane with me? It could have killed the territory. As it was, there was still a serious concern that the promotion had to address. Like Wahoo, Tim, Mr. Wrestling Woods was regarded by fans as someone who'd never kicked back with the likes of Ric Flair and Johnny Valentine, particularly since Valentine had supposedly broken his leg in a recent TV storyline and was supposed to defend the U.S. title against him in the main event in Wilmington. Before the show began at Legion Stadium, the ring announcer informed the crowd that there had been a plane crash earlier the day and that Valentine and Flair were injured. The spectators were also told in an unrelated incident Tim Woods was lost and couldn't be there either. Even as he checked into the hospital, Tim was protecting the business. He identified himself by his given name, George Burrow Wooden, and claimed to be a wrestling promoter. Because he wrestled under a mask, there was the possibility that no one would make the connection, but rumors started fast, and if Tim's actual whereabouts ended up in the press, it would have been a huge hit to the industry. So, the next day, on his own, Tim checked himself out of the hospital. 2 people propped themselves under each arm and literally deposited him on a commercial flight back to Charlotte. Amazingly, the brakes failed when the plane landed, but at least this time there were no injuries. Immediately, Tim began making appearances all over the territory to dispel any speculation that he had been hospitalized. Then, 2 weeks after the crash, he stepped into the ring in unbearable pain and wrestled superstar Billy Graham. I believe they had a relatively short match, but Tim was more than Mr. Wrestling that day. He became the man who saved wrestling. Mid-Atlantic, anyways. Mike Farkas, the 28-year-old pilot, lingered in a coma for about a year before he died. He was truly beyond negligent and incompetent, but I still feel badly for him. On 2 occasions I visited him in the hospital. Bruggers and Valentine had both suffered broken backs. After 10 days at the hospital in Wilmington, Jimmy Crockett chartered a plane and had them flown out for more specialized service in Houston. Bruggers had a steel rod inserted into his spinal column and was released 3 weeks later. I believe that he could have wrestled again, but he just wasn't into it. So he took the $70,000 he received in the insurance settlement, retired, married a flight attendant, and bought a bar in West Palm Beach. I heard that Valentine had virtually the same injuries as Bruggers, but by the time the surgery took place, the nerve endings were apparently calcified and the damage could not be repaired. As a result, this 47-year-old superstar, who'd been selling out arenas and stirring up shit for his for nearly a generation was paralyzed from the waist down. Understandably, he was pretty miserable. When I resumed my wrestling career, I would occasionally pick him up and drive him to the different arenas. Wahoo, Red Bastion, and I would also bring him to our homes for meals. A lot of the other guys stayed away from him. With all the mean-spirited jokes he pulled, he got less sympathy than most people in his position. Even Bastion didn't forget. After a show in Columbus, South Carolina, Valentine got drunk and fell out of his braces in his front yard. With Valentine's wife standing right there, Bastion pulled out the Bishop, his own personal name for his dick, and pissed on his friend. "That's for all the years you pissed on me," he taunted. Valentine was laying there helpless going, but he was also smiling like he enjoyed it. He was still one of the boys. My back was broken in 3 places, yet remarkably I didn't need surgery. I just had to wait to heal. It was all a matter of where we were positioned on the plane and how our bodies fell. My weight had dropped from 255 to 180. Whenever I asked about when I could wrestle again, I'd hear, "Only time will tell." Some doctors, including my own father, believed that I would never be able to perform at a high level in the ring with the injuries I'd endured. The more optimistic ones predicted that I wouldn't be wrestling for at least 2 years. But hell, I was 24 years old. I couldn't wait that long. I loved wrestling and everything about it, and I believed with all my heart that I would recover sooner. I just wouldn't be denied. Superstar Billy Graham anecdote. "I walked into Rick's house in Charlotte. He was flat on his back with all the hospital equipment around him. I thought, this guy's been in a plane wreck. How's he going to come back? But there was never any doubt in his mind. His confidence just seeped through as he lay there with that Ric Flair smile. There was just zero negativity. All positive vibes coming off of this guy. Totally positive. Jimmy took care of me, making sure that I had money coming in besides the $35,000 I received in insurance. The first day I could get out of bed, I went to the office wearing this huge body brace. I was looking for a pat on the back. "Wow, you just got out of bed and you're here already? You're the man." Instead, George Scott glared at me. "Take that fucking thing off," he said. "What?" "That fucking back brace. Jesus Christ. Don't you know it's holding up your recovery time?" "It is?" "Yeah, it fucking is. When you wear those damn things, the rest of your muscles atrophy. You gotta let your muscles build themselves back. What the fuck is wrong with you? You're gonna be out an extra 6 months now." George was giving me some old school wrestler's home remedy, though he did kind of know what he was talking about. It's true that with a back brace the muscles can atrophy, but I also needed to keep myself intact. What a heartless bastard he was for saying that, but it served me right for searching for compassion in such a callous profession. So I wore my brace in the house when no one from the wrestling business was around, and never went back to the office until I recuperated. That meant that I had to spend a lot of time at home. Obviously, I never enjoyed being idle, but I loved being with Megan. She was taking her first steps, so we learned to walk as a team. One of the fondest memories of my life is holding her hand and toddling up and down the street with her. Another high point was when I finally received medical clearance to make my comeback. I was elated and called everyone I knew. In early 1976, I strolled into WRAL studios in my suit and sunglasses to an audience that really didn't want to boo me. Announcer Ed Caprell handed me a stack of get well cards and letters from fans. I contemplated the pile scornfully, said that I was going to keep the cards, that I was only going to keep the cards from Raquel Welch and Joey Heatherton, then threw everything else on the floor. The crowd turned on me instantly, and that got the ball rolling again. I had them just where I wanted, just where they were supposed to be. Looking at Ric Flair and wishing it was me who died in the plane crash. Chapter 5. Where does a turkey like this fit into my plans? And there's a caption, and it says, Greg the Hammer Valentine and I had different styles, but we worked well together. And it shows Ric Flair and Greg. There, it looks like a tag match, and there's Ric Flair, and then there's Greg the Hammer Valentine in the back. Greg Valentine was brought in to replace his father. Greg resembled Johnny, both facially and by the fact that he was a good, solid performer who worked a rough, believable style. He was called the Hammer because of the way he'd lean an opponent backward over the ropes, then smash him across the chest with a forearm. The blow would come down so hard that sweat would fly everywhere. If anyone doubted the authenticity of wrestling, I'd have liked to see them get in the ring and take that move. His opponents believed, that's for sure. Backstage, we called Greg the Turtle because he moved at his own pace, at his own time, even if it meant getting to the arena late. When we teamed together, I did most of the talking while he was the quiet guy who definitely carried a little bit of that Valentine mystique. We were a good pair. He dressed nicely and knew how to represent the business. And he was accepted in the dressing room not because of his name, but because he established his own identity. In 1976 and 77, we were the NWA Tag Team Champions twice, trading the title back and forth with my, quote, cousins in the Minnesota wrestling crew. Both of us had these long, elaborate ring robes made by Olivia Walker, whose husband, Johnny, was Mr. Wrestling 2, Jim Wood's tag team partner. George Scott had introduced me to Olivia when I was convalescing, and her work was awesome. In addition to ring attire, she had created sequined outfits for Charo and other entertainers. Among her creations for me was a green robe that looked like it had a boa sewn along the lapels, and a sparkling blue robe with Nature Boy in white glitter across the back. At one point, I had 22 robes, but I've since given some to charity, had others stolen, and even lost 2 that hung in the Nitro Cafe that WCW opened in Las Vegas. When the restaurant closed, the robes disappeared. Today, I have only 7 left. The last 2 robes Olivia made were lousy compared to the rest of her work. The quality just wasn't there. I must have sounded a little harsh when I asked her why. Well, I haven't been feeling well, she answered. The truth was that she had cancer and didn't tell me. She was bravely going about her business, working as hard as she could. To this day, I think about how disappointed she must have been by my reaction, and it makes me feel terrible. Olivia played a big role and created the aura of Ric Flair. She was the best. Throughout my recovery, I remained the Mid-Atlantic heavyweight champion, and Wahoo was still the number 1 contender, so we picked up where we left off. I returned to action at the Greensboro Coliseum on January 31st, 1976, resplendent in one of Olivia's robes. Wahoo grabbed it, rolled it up in a ball, and threw it into the crowd. On television, a short time later, we did a segment where I beat Wahoo with a table leg. I didn't realize there was a nail sticking out of it, however, and I opened him up so badly that it needed 42 stitches. I'll tell you this, any fan that saw that on television wasn't thinking about the plane crash anymore. Unfortunately, I still was. I was nervous about taking a backdrop, so George Scott came up with his own kind of therapeutic solution. He put me in the ring with Tim Woods for an hour, for 14 straight days until I took one. Nonetheless, I couldn't get myself to fall flat. If you watch me in the ring now, I still land on my left side after a backdrop, never the center of my back like people are taught in wrestling school. Other aspects of my in-ring repertoire also developed around this time. Okay, here's a picture of Ric Flair, and I think it looks like Sting. And it said, years after the plane crash, I still won't fall flat on my back properly. Not even while wrestling guys I trusted implicitly like Sting. And Sting looks like he's about to do a backdrop on him. My opponent would whip me into a corner and I'd flip over the turnbuckle, land feet first on the ring apron, and stumble forward. From the opposite end of the ropes, my opponent would meet me with a clothesline or chop, sending me hurtling into the ringside. In the same match, I'd climb the ropes to jump on my opponent, but when I got to the top, the guy would position himself underneath me and throw me across the ring. As soon as I landed, I'd tense up my body and let out an agonized "Arrgh!" The knife-edge chops that have become such a big part of my routine were largely inspired by Wahoo and Terry Funk. Wahoo was an incredibly physical wrestler who worked in a very rugged style. It was never his intention to deliberately hurt his opponent. He was just Wahoo. Sometimes he'd get tired and hit you in the mouth, or he'd throw you off the ropes and you'd come back to a chop in the nose or ear. Wahoo also kept his blade taped in his wristband, and the thing would come loose. In Norfolk once, he grabbed me by the hair and went into his Indian war dance while his blade pierced my eyelid. "Jesus Christ, Wahoo!" I yelled. "Hold still! Hold still!" "Fuck!" he muttered, pulling me closer toward him, not realizing that the blade was now penetrating my eyebrow and leaving a large flap of skin dangling over my eye. "Wahoo, you motherfucker, you just cut me up!" "Quit complaining," he said. "I've had more stitches in my foreskin than you've had all over your fucking body." And now here's a picture of Wahoo and Ric Flair in an Indian strap match. And the Flair, and the caption for this is Wahoo and I in an Indian strap match. Wahoo enjoyed laying into me with loud chops that echoed through the arena and brought a feeling of authenticity to the action. He loved it even more when I gave it right back to him. A lot of guys don't like getting chopped. It stings and it hurts. Some guys don't like getting slammed, but there were no limitations in matches with Wahoo as long as the crowd was into it. I'm flattered that today, in any arena in the world, when any wrestler gives his opponent that hard, slapping chop, the fans scream, "Woo!" As much as there's a lot of Wahoo in those chops, someone else deserves credit too. Terry Funk. When he was the NWA World Champion, I watched him wrestle Paul Jones in Raleigh one night. Jones grabbed Terry's arm and Terry started backhand chopping the guy. A short time later, I began doing the same thing in my matches. I also copied Terry's habit of holding on to the ropes with one hand and chopping his opponent with the other. Whenever Terry came to town, I knew it was going to be a fun night. Once, after a show in Raleigh, the two of us drove back to Charlotte with Jimmy Crockett and Greg Valentine, who was behind the wheel. Along the way, I picked up a fifth of Everclear, 100 proof clear alcohol, and poured some into Terry's beers. Terry was completely hammered. So was I, by the way, and he was pissing off Greg, trying to light his hair on fire with a cigarette lighter while he was driving. When we got back to Charlotte, Terry took off all his clothes except for his cowboy boots and the NWA Championship belt and started directing traffic. Every wrestling fan that drove by had a story for the rest of his or her life. Next, Terry decided to pay a visit to my house. As he was stepping, naked, onto the property, I warned him to be careful because I had a pit bull. Rising to the challenge, Terry stood in my front yard and dared the dog to take a piece of him. The pit bull leaped over the fence, jumped off Terry, and bit him through the nose. Leslie was out with her friends, but we had a babysitter watching. Megan and the poor girl was hiding in the closet. Funk was furious. He pulled my shotgun off the wall and started screaming like a maniac. Then he got a knife, put it between his teeth like a pirate, and began crawling around the yard, trying to get the dog. By that point, I felt sick, so I vomited and fell down on the kitchen floor. A few minutes later, Leslie came home, surveyed the scene, and uttered, My God." She turned to one of her girlfriends and pointed at me, laying in my own puke in the kitchen. "I want you to meet my husband," she said sarcastically. "And that's the world champion, Terry Funk, crawling around in the backyard on his hands and knees, naked." Leslie gathered up Terry's clothes and threw them onto the front yard. The next morning I woke up in his hotel room. To this day, I don't know how I got there. The year after the accident ended up becoming a good one. In 1976, for the first time ever, I made $100,000. On interviews, I'd periodically tease the fans and call myself the People's Champion, acting oblivious to the fact that the crowd was shouting for my dismemberment. The Rock uses the same term, but goes out of his way whenever he sees me to say that I was the original People's Champion. From time to time, Jimmy Crockett would exchange talent with other promoters for special shows. Although Vince McMahon Sr. had originally started the WWF, the company that later became the World Wrestling Federation, and then the WWE, because of a conflict with the NWA, by 1976, the wounds were healed enough that I was flown to New York twice for appearances at Madison Square Garden. The matches were hardly classics in one confrontation. I beat Pete Sanchez, and another, Frankie Williams, both wrestlers who lost on television every week. But it was cool to be at the Garden, the place that was known as the Mecca of professional wrestling, and I invited my father to New York to see it himself. After the show, the two of us went to dinner at Mama Leone's, the big Italian restaurant in Manhattan, with superstar Billy Graham. This wasn't Minnesota, and my father couldn't help but be impressed. Whether he fully approved of my career choice, I'll never know, but he definitely knew that I was making it as a wrestler. I was actually backstage at Madison Square Garden on the night that Stan Hansen broke WWF champion Bruno Sammartino's neck. In reality, Hansen was pretty green at the time, and he dropped Bruno the wrong way. The promotion claimed that Stan put Sammartino out of action with a running clothesline called the Lariat, and held their rematch in Shea Stadium. The same night, they simulcast Muhammad Ali's boxer versus wrestling bout with Antonio Inoki from Japan. Bruno definitely generated intensity, and the fans in the Northeast went crazy for him. I have to admit, though, that I was far from overwhelmed. He was a tremendous draw, a great spokesman for the guys, but not a good in-ring performer. Sammartino could put an opponent in a bear hug or lift him over his back, but he was limited, especially compared to versatile NWA champions like Harley Race, Dory Funk Jr., and Jack Briscoe. The wrestling magazines all came out of New York, so Bruno was always number one in the rankings. But after seeing him wrestle, I thought, how could anyone rate him ahead of Harley? Christ, how could this guy be champion of anything? I recognized that Bruno was loved in New York, Boston, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, and other WWF cities where people were very conscious of their immigrant roots and enjoyed seeing an ethnic champion. But in my opinion, Pedro Morales, who held the title from 1971 to 73, was better. That's why he was able to work in different territories. When Sammartino came to St. Louis, where the NWA was headquartered, no one cared because he was so far below the standards of the wrestlers they knew as champions. With all the fond memories his fans have, Bruno should still be regarded as a hero, even though he became a bitter man who has spent much of his retirement burying the business that gave him his money and fame. It's just ludicrous. I've told my second wife, Beth, there's more about her later, that if she outlives me, I never want her criticizing professional wrestling. It's because of professional wrestling that we've been able to travel around the world together, expose our children to people who are the best in their fields, and live a lifestyle that most Americans could never imagine. Bruno should be able to enjoy the things that this industry gave him and become a frequent visitor in the dressing room. Like the late Freddie Blassie, with the boys coming over to listen to his stories. Unfortunately, he hasn't been able to change with the times and accept that wrestling will never be the same as it was in 1965. Nonetheless, a lot of older fans continue to characterize Bruno as great, a term that is thrown around much too liberally. When I was starting out, great applied to Harley, Jack Briscoe, the Funk Brothers, Ray Stevens, Dick Murdoch, Red Bastion, and Nick Bockwinkel. I never saw him in his heyday, but from everything I've heard, Vern Gagne was a great performer. The same applies to Lou Thesz, who is the NWA champion from 1948 to 1956, except for a one 8-month period. Ricky Steamboat was a great in-ring performer. Triple H, Eddie Guerrero, and Chris Benoit are great in-ring performers. Austin is great. Arn was great. Shawn Michaels was the very best performer the World Wrestling Federation had to offer, and the first guy that made me aware that even greatness can be challenged. He was much better than Bret Hart. There was really no comparison. Even today, after all his back problems, Shawn can still be the best performer on any given show. Then you have Undertaker, who I admire not just because of his ring work, but because he's been a household name for over a decade. Kurt Angle is great because he can wrestle with anybody, but he's still relatively new to the business, so he needs longevity. Kurt Hennig, Terry Bam Bam Gordy, and Barry Windham were great performers in their prime, like Angle, but Hennig didn't always mentally show up. Gordy developed a drug problem, and Barry just stopped taking care of himself as he got older. Let's not forget the referees. Earl Hebner and Tommy Young are great. There was a lot of nights I couldn't have made it an hour without Tommy. To make a baseball analogy, Ken Griffey Jr. may have been a great player for a few years, but that doesn't make him the greatest of all time. Jose Canseco was going to be the next Mickey Mantle, and instead he ended up a disgrace. I have every reason to believe that Kurt Angle won't fall into the same trap, but right now he's Alex Rodriguez, the young player with the potential to be the greatest. If A-Rod stays healthy, he's going to break all the records. If Angle stays healthy, he'll be one of the very best ever. 3 years after moving to Charlotte, I was still learning the secrets to becoming great. I prided myself on my cardiovascular conditioning. I never wanted to tire out in the middle of a match. From the time I started in wrestling, I did 500 free squats a day until 1986 when I bought my first Stairmaster. The really good in-ring performers can speak to each other during a match. Hey, how about this? Or let's try this. If they do things properly, even the referee barely notices that they're having a conversation. Today, my fans insist that I can have a great match with a broom. At times, I honestly think a broom would be easier. At least a broom can't mess things up. Over the years, I've worked with wrestlers who actually had less ability than a broom. Guys who played politics or who had the right cosmetic look, but I didn't think deserved to wear a pair of wrestling tights. I was determined to wrestle a classic every night and willing to sell my heart out to make it happen. If a guy had a big move, I'd react huge to it, making him look like a legend. I discovered that once you showed that type of good faith, most opponents would sell all your stuff too. The important thing was how the fans felt when the night was over. You have to make them think that they are part of it. That's what Steve Austin and The Rock have been able to do. Reach into the audience and touch the people. Every great drawing card has had that skill in his own way. Wahoo, Dusty, Hulk Hogan, and yes, Bruno Sammartino. Here's an anecdote from a referee, Charles Robinson. In the 1970s, I'd be front row every single week in Charlotte. Before the Charlotte Hornets and the Carolina Panthers turned up here, Ric Flair and professional wrestling were the deal. I was different than other fans because I liked Ric Flair. In fact, I made some life-size posters of him. I draw a picture of Rick and sew sequins and rhinestones on the paper. I was so obnoxious. I was trying to be like Flair. Every time I was at the arena, I got into an altercation with fans trying to tear up my posters. It got so bad that my grandfather, a Charlotte police officer, arranged for another policeman to escort me everywhere so that the other fans didn't beat me up. Okay, and then here's a picture with Ricky Steamboat, and the caption to this picture says, "My rivalry with Ricky Steamboat always brought fans to their feet." And Ricky Steamboat has Ric Flair in some type of arm lock. It didn't happen all at once, but I periodically noticed that some people thought my style of riling up the crowd was cool. I can't recall exactly when I started getting heated reactions just by pointing at chubby guys in the crowd and screaming, "Shut up, fat boy!" But I did it so much that by the 1990s, a sizable amount of the audience would cheer whenever they heard this catchphrase. Some people even held signs with an arrow pointing down at them under the inscription, "Fat Boy." What mattered most was that the crowd was entertained. I appreciated that attitude in other athletes like Joe Namath and Wilt Chamberlain, two guys I enjoyed as much for their flamboyance as for their accomplishments. On television, I began improving myself, trying to project the same image I'd come out. Trying to project the same image. I'd come out for interviews in a long black mink, just like the one Dusty Rhodes owned. Whatever Dusty bought, I bought too. Jimmy Crockett was looking for more talent and contacted the Atlanta territory. Richard Blood was a muscular kid with a strain of Asian ancestry that gave him a handsome, exotic look. Under the name Rick Steamboat, he was billed as a native Hawaiian and the son of veteran Sam Steamboat. We had a 400-pound wrestler named One Man Gang who Atlanta promoter Jim Barnett wanted, so he and Jimmy made a trade. Crockett believed he was getting a talented prospect, but from the moment we met, I knew Steamboat had magic. Like me, Steamboat had been trained by Vern Gagne, so we were automatically friends. I also understood that anybody who survived Gagne's camp had to be good. On June 15, 1977, we introduced him to the territory in dramatic fashion. He walked into the TV studio in Raleigh and pinned me clean in the middle of the ring, winning my Mid-Atlantic TV title. The upset established Ricky as a serious force and did nothing to hurt my momentum. On July 9th, I won my first U.S. Heavyweight Championship, unseating one of my childhood favorites, Bobo Brazil. I promised the streak through the Richmond Coliseum if I'd lost. I promised to streak through the Richmond Coliseum if I'd lost. Whenever I thought about Steamboat, I imagined the two of us headlining and blowing the house away. So I went to George Scott and asked, how about letting me get a main event program with this guy? Admittedly, it made a lot of guys in the back sick to see a kid like this being elevated. Most of the heroes in Mid-Atlantic were 35 or older, and dubious about whether Steamboat had earned the right to headline. But George obviously respected me enough to give it a shot. The title went back and forth a couple of times, but we weren't drawing the kind of money I had anticipated, so we tried something different. On April 9th, 1978, I appeared on TV, offering to put up my U.S. championship against the newcomer right there in the studio. Steamboat came over to the interview area wearing an open robe and Hawaiian necklace. He was apparently surprised by the gesture. I walked up to him and shoved him. "Perhaps you didn't hear me," I yelled. "Get in there and wrestle me right now." I was the first one in the ring, laying down the U.S. title on the mat and holding my arms open as Steamboat advanced towards me. As soon as he bent to step through the ropes, I charged. As anyone who listened to my interviews knew, I was the dirtiest player in the game. Pulled him into the ring and rubbed his face on the mat. I seemed crazed now and threw Steamboat back to ringside, where I ground his face into the studio floor. The referee tried to stop me, but I shoved him aside and continued the attack, snap-marring Steamboat, then dragging his face across the ground and sticking it into the television camera. "There's your pretty boy!" I shrieked, reminding anyone who hadn't noticed that Steamboat was a sex symbol. "Now he's ugly!" To underscore my point, I rubbed the championship belt into Ricky's face and eye. Here's a anecdote by Ricky Steamboat. While the beating was going on, Rick put me in a position where I was sitting on my butt. He pulled back my head to his face, close to mine, and said, "Rick, I'm really sorry I have to do this." Then he gave me a hard-way shot to swell out my eye. We wanted Steamboat to look beaten up when he went on the road for our grudge matches, so we took him upstairs into the dressing room and really administered some torture. Harley Race was like a doctor in situations like this. He wanted to hit him real hard and break his eyebrows open, but after some discussion with Wahoo and myself, he simply cut Ricky's face in 5 places with folded sandpaper, poured iodine into the wounds, and rubbed sandpaper across the scars. Here's another anecdote by Ricky Steamboat. Harley sent David Crockett to get the sandpaper, and David came back with what I call the variety pack. At the top was a very fine sandpaper, and then you went through the other varieties like a deck of cards until you got to the end, which looked like there were granite rocks glued to the paper. A couple of guys were holding my arms when Harley said, "Kid, this is gonna hurt." He started to sandpaper my face up around the eye, literally taking the hairs of my eyebrow completely off. When my skin dried, it looked creased. Even after I healed, my skin was discolored for 6 to 8 months. I remember walking to a 7-Eleven and people kept looking at my face and going, "Oh my God, that was real?" As great as this looked, it didn't open the door I had wanted. But we were getting there. I just needed one more creative hook to make it work. I'd purchased a 1974 Lincoln Continental limo that looked brand new. I traveled all over the territory in it with my friend and my chauffeur, Terry Brown. He was in high school when I first met him, working at his parents' Texaco station about a mile from my house. I don't remember exactly what I paid him, but I do know that because of our association, he got laid every night. On November 1st, 1978, Terry drove me up in front of the WRAL studios with 2 girls who worked for a local modeling agency. By coincidence, one of them, a pretty blonde named Bonnie, would later become Rick Steamboat's wife. With a lady on each arm, I strolled up to the interview area, all dressed up, and announced, Everybody knows that Ric Flair lives a life that makes guys like Joe Namath and every average human being in the world go dizzy. Ask these girls, who's the #1 man in the whole wide world? Tell them, girl. Nature Boy, they swooned, leaning into the microphone. Holding up a photo of a freshly bruised Steamboat, I continued, Where do you figure that a turkey like this fits into my plans, huh? Ricky Steamboat's probably sitting in a corner somewhere sucking his thumb while Nature Boy Ric Flair stands before the whole world with the 2 most gorgeous human beings on the face of the earth. Apparently feeling emasculated, Steamboat stepped onto the set. Check out the turkey, girls, I said, swaggering as the future Bonnie Steamboat twirled her hair. Steamboat slapped me and ran my head into the ring post, then dragged me by my tie through the ropes. He slung me into the cables, delivered a double thrust to my neck, and tore off my jacket. Lurching forward, I swung at Steamboat, but he ducked under the blow, got me on my knees, and pulled my dress shirt over my head. Now I was bare-chested except for my tie. After a knee drop to my chest, Ricky tore off the waistband of my pants and the upper portion of my left trouser leg. With the fans shouting in disbelief, he kept tearing, leaving me in nothing but my tie, dress shoes, socks, and tiny briefs. I like to say that I was one of the first television personalities to model a thong years before it became popular. Finally, everything clicked. We went back on the road, and from day one, we sold out everywhere. More significantly, this feud transformed Steamboat from an up-and-comer into the superstar he deserved to be. Here's a anecdote by Rick Steamboat. George Scott would ask us to go 20 or 30 minutes, and we'd go 60. At the 59-minute mark, the announcer would be on the public address system. 1 minute to go! 1 minute to go! Everybody in the house would be standing up. At 15 seconds, we'd go for the finish. Maybe Flair would go over. Maybe I would. It didn't matter. We gave them such a good match, they didn't really care who won that night. Here's a picture of Ricky Steamboat beating the shit out of Ric Flair. Here's an anecdote by David Crockett. The rivalry was a great thing for the company. Ric Flair had all the moves, the talk, the walk of a veteran at a young age. And now, instead of dealing mainly with fans between 38 and 60 years old, we were drawing a younger audience. Suddenly, we had teenagers coming to the matches to see Ricky Steamboat. Steamboat had everything: charisma, work rate, intensity, and one of the best bodies in our business. He was training for the Mr. North Carolina contest at one point while wrestling me for a minimum of 30 minutes a night on 60 carbs a day. He was just amazing. If he had any drawback, it's that he never played the bad guy. Unlike wrestlers who could get the crowd to either love them or hate them, he only knew how to be the hero. But he's the greatest wrestler I've ever wrestled. And then there's a picture that says, Steamboat was the antithesis of everything the Nature Boy represented, and one of the greatest guys I've ever known. It's a picture of Ric Flair and Ricky Steamboat standing alongside each other in the 80s as friends. And that's the end of Chapter 5, and I will return tomorrow with Chapter 6. So thank you guys. Give this video a like and a comment and tell me what you think about it. Fuck yeah, I love you.